Good morning, everybody. Dr. Murphy herself, she's a neurological services manager and a psychotherapist who works with Rehab Care in Galway. This morning, she's going to explore the cognitive impacts associated with MS, including fatigue, memory and adjustment, and have a look at practical toolkits to support these symptoms. So I think in terms of questions and answers that you might have, if you can just use the Q&A icons at the bottom or the chat icons at the bottom to send your questions in. What we'll try and do is we can forward the questions then to Dr. Murphy as they come in, and maybe stop every 5 or 10 minutes and put the questions to her. And then at the end, she'll be able to take some more questions then. So we're ready to go. I'll hand you over to Dr. Murphy now. And hopefully we'll be able to get her. So, okay, Dr. Murphy, I'll let you just start.
Thank you, John.
Great.
Good morning, everybody. I hope you can all hear me all right. But thank you all for coming on the webinar today. It's lovely to see the number of participants that are here this morning. So I hope you'll find some benefit from it. As John was saying, there are plenty of options for questions and answers and discussion. So please feel free to get involved. In terms of today, as John said, we were just going to cover some cognitive impacts that can be associated with MS and look at some general strategies that through our work with Rehab Care in collaboration with the MS Society, that people would have been involved in developing some of these strategies and trialing them and seeing what has worked really well. So just in terms of today, as I was saying, we'll just look at the aims and objectives. We'll look at what the cognitive symptoms are and look at the practical strategies that we've looked at developing. So in terms of MS impacts, MS can have all sorts of impacts, and you all will be experts in that. Some are physical and they can be a lot more easily recognized, but there can be a lot of hidden effects, particularly cognitive impacts or emotional changes. And those are the ones that are a lot more invisible, which would be why I had the slide at the very beginning with the image, just kind of saying an invisible illness. Because cognitive impacts are difficulties within the brain or the emotional impacts, they can be much harder to see, and with that they can be much harder to communicate to people, and they can be much more difficult for others to understand. So they can create a lot of challenges for people with MS. So in terms of cognitive impacts, why would we be experiencing them? So in terms of our brain cells, the brain would consist of about 100 billion tiny little cells called neurons. And each one of those are connected to thousands of others. So what happens then is that we have trillions of different routes that a message can go around our brain. And each brain cell can receive thousands of these signals every second. So our brain is incredibly busy, as you all know. And in different parts of the brain, our neurons can carry different signals. So it allows us to kind of pick up things, hear things, see things, think things. And in terms of this, then if we look at this old map of the London Underground, this is kind of what our brain can look like when we're trying to send signals. So you can see that there's lots of different lines, lots of different colors, and lots of different stops. And that's, if we even take an example of trying to pick up a cup of tea, one of those lines, and if we were together, I'd be showing you the very bottom long black line. We've normally used that as an example of that's the signal trying to pick up the cup of tea. And sometimes with MS, and everybody would be familiar with the myelin sheath and the insulating layer that can get impacted and kind of struggle sending the electronic impulses, which means those signals are not getting caught. So what's happening is that our signals are getting lost and we're getting caught in a stop in the London Underground. So we might be able to recognize that we have to pick up the cup of tea, but physically our hand might not be able to wrap around the cup and pick it up or whatever. So our brain struggles with the signals and we get lost. And what we need to do is find different strategies or alternative strategies to deal with the same message. So we might need to look at a different colored line within that map to be able to pick up the cup of tea. And in terms of the cognitive impairments then that can be associated with living with MS, and this would just be a very quick, snapshot of them, but we could have attention and concentration difficulties. So we mightn't be able to attend to something as well as we used to. Even a talk like this, we might find it very difficult to attend fully. Or, normally what happens even when we're in talks ourselves, we might dip in and out. Our attention can wane. We might have poor concentration. We might get distracted. In terms of our memory, we might find it difficult to take on some new learnings. We might become forgetful, or we might be seen to be forgetful, or we might have difficulties with our short term memory. That's what STM would stand for there. So I might have said something a couple of minutes ago, and somebody might struggle to remember that. And we'll look at strategies around that. We might have difficulty with thinking, so our complex ideas or abstract ideas. We might end up needing to be very concrete and very rigid with what we're thinking. So we might have done something a certain way all the way along, and that might be what we need to try and protect or preserve because it's the easiest way for us. We might have difficulties with our insight or awareness of our deficits, and that's no different to people who don't live with MS. We might struggle with having insight or awareness to our blind spots. In terms of planning and organization skills, we might have difficulty with planning and forward planning. We might be a little bit disorganized, or we could be perceived to be disorganized. We might have difficulty just with self-monitoring our own checks and identifying what we need to do to keep ourselves well and to manage our difficulties. Or we might not recognize that we've made an error in something and how we need to support that, enhance it. In terms of our reasoning, so what I was saying around the thinking, we can be a little bit concrete at times, or we might have poor concept of time, which would tie in with the poor planning and organizing. We might struggle with understanding and recognizing something happening 6 months down the line, and that can happen for various different reasons. Or we might struggle with trying to forward plan for next week. We might find it very overwhelming, or we might forget things. In terms of information processing, that's another really big one, alongside attention and concentration. So it would be our speed in which we take in information. So while I'm talking, you're processing what I'm talking, and how the speed and how we all process that is different. But if we're living with a neurological condition like MS, our speed of processing can be a little bit more slow. And so that's why even when John was saying that every few minutes we might stop and see if there's any questions, just to try and help with that processing piece. In addition to capacity, there's only so much we're all going to be able to retain. And that's why slides are really helpful to try and support that. Another really common impairment or cognitive impairment could be fatigue. And that would be one that I'd be speaking with yourselves about today, and how we can look at managing that, because fatigue can be very, very silent and it can be very debilitating. And a lot of people can struggle with understanding fatigue when we're living with it. So in terms of our cognitive symptoms, then, most people would experience multiple cognitive difficulties from that slide, and all difficulties are unique to everybody. So what one person might experience in terms of fatigue, somebody else might experience in memory. And then some people might experience difficulties with attention and difficulties with information processing. But it's unique to everybody. And that's why when we look at practical strategies, it's about finding what works for you. So in terms of the impacts then of cognitive symptoms, and this would be some of the things that we ourselves might feel, but also the people who are around us, our supporters, our professionals that are working with us, they might struggle as well. So, a lot of the people that we would have worked with via yourselves, the MS Society, would say that they would feel quite misunderstood, or that their independence would be reduced, or we'd have a lot of vocational difficulties, might not be able to do the type of role that you may have been working in for the last number of years, and start maybe trying to find something new, or needing to find something new. People can feel quite isolated, and that's where the MS Society can really help support that peer network. Changes in the family role or in the family system might happen, and we might have difficulties with our peers, which tie in with the social isolation. And notwithstanding, if there's changes in the work and family home, that there would be absolutely financial difficulties, and there's a lot to contend with whilst actually trying to navigate an MS diagnosis and manage the flare-ups and the changes. So there's a huge amount of impacts just to the cognitive symptoms. So in terms of today, we're going to look at fatigue, we're going to look at attention and concentration, we're going to look at memory, and we'll just look at some adjustment as well. John, I'm just wondering if there's any questions or if you want to pause before we move into some strategies.
As far as I can see, I don't think there's any questions at this stage, Michelle, so we'll maybe just carry on if that's okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Great.
So in terms of compensatory strategies, why would we even need them? So no more than the underground map that I was showing a while ago. It's about offering alternative ways to complete a task. It's about using what we're really good at or what we're really strong at. So although we're talking about cognitive impact, there are still some things that we're very, very strong in. Developing compensatory strategies will absolutely increase independence and autonomy. And those two things or those two concepts can be very difficult to navigate, as I said, when it comes to flare-ups or as the illness is progressing. But a variety of strategies can be adopted. So as I said, there'll be a pick and mix, and it'll be a pick and mix that'll be different for everybody. And they'll be used for different times or for different reasons. But it's important to find out what your strengths are and then identifying what strategies work for you. That will become the most beneficial form of moving on with your practical toolkit. So in terms of fatigue, just in terms of giving a brief overview about what it is, and fatigue management would be something that I'd be very, very passionate about when working with people with neurological difficulties. It would be something that I think can be quite underrated. And I think if people can learn to manage their fatigue, it will absolutely have a snowball effect or snowball impact on all of the other impacts that we might experience. But it can be a feeling of exhaustion and tiredness, or a weariness or a lack of energy. And there's primary and secondary fatigue in relation to MS, and it can cause a lot of difficulties in relation to physical illness, mental health difficulties, cognitive fatigue, as I've just briefly mentioned, difficulties with just managing on a day-to-day basis with some tasks, and difficulties with relationships. So even, having a conversation with somebody or being in a social setting or a group setting can be incredibly fatiguing. People would need to develop strategies pre and post an interpersonal encounter to try and manage that. It can appear very suddenly, it can last longer, and it can take longer to recover, but it's incredibly common and it's very real. And the reason why I have that in there is just to support what I was saying about feeling misunderstood. We recognize that it is common and it is real. And there can be lots of symptoms associated with fatigue. And everybody that we would have worked with would have attested to a lot of these symptoms over multiple occasions. You might have a number of them, but there'd be, withdrawing from kind of social encounters or daily life. There'd be change in appetite. You might find slower movement and speech. You might find that your mood has changed. You might become a little bit more irritable or anxious. Might have crying spells. Could be a lack of interest in activities. And some of that could also be the physical inability to engage in those activities. It can be poor attention and concentration, weaker muscles, poor mobility or balance, and low motivation. Feel quite overwhelmed, a lot of information processing difficulties. So what I was talking about a while ago might become slow. You might become slower with processing information. You might find that you're experiencing increased difficulties with making decisions or problem solving. You might become a little bit more forgetful, or you might recognize that you have some difficulties with your vision, which then impact if you were still driving, how you would manage driving. Word finding difficulties and headaches. So that's just a snapshot of some of the symptoms that we would have identified when working with people with MS. But I wanted to throw in this slide because when we talk about fatigue, it's very different. It isn't just the generic weariness or lack of energy that I was talking about earlier. It's much more than that when living with a neurological condition. It's tiredness that people complain. It's not the tiredness that we complain about after a late night. It's a bone-crushing weariness that makes you doubt whether you can continue to function for even an hour or more. It's much less until the end of the day with all that's going on. And the cognitive function just goes out the window and it adds to frustration. And that just, for us, that really conceptualizes how impacting fatigue is for people living with MS. So in terms of fatigue management, and again, what I would be hoping that people would get from today is that everybody can learn to manage fatigue, regardless of where people are at with their diagnosis. There are a lot of strategies out there, and there are a lot of support, particularly with through the MS Society, that can help with it. But in terms of looking at the first step, so one of the first things that we would always recommend is identifying what your triggers are. So what is actually causing you fatigue, and looking at the times of the day where you might feel most fatigue, and also the types of activities, and looking at the severity of the fatigue. And how we do that is by completing a fatigue diary. So we're trying to identify what our activities are, what are when we're resting, what our fatigue is like, and that helps determine our patterns of behavior. And when we're able to then determine what our pattern of behavior is and the level of fatigue we have, we're actually able to tailor our day around fatigue. And actually, what happens then is fatigue becomes part of our day rather than the fatigue taking over our day. This is just a very brief snapshot of what a fatigue diary would look at. So normally, when we're working with people with MS, we would support people to complete a diary for a couple of weeks, and that can be done in any way that suits the person. So it can be, we'll say, a diary where you just literally log your activities, the time of them, and you rate your severity. It can be something that you're doing on the iPad. It can be something you're doing online. It's however a fatigue diary is going to work for you. But in terms of today and for the webinar, I've just put up this in terms of what it would look like if it was on a page. We look at the day, and we're just saying Monday, and we're saying the time is 8 a.m. The activity is that somebody has just woken up and they've had a shower. But what they've noticed is they have a slight balance difficulty. And we're asking everyone then to rate their fatigue levels in relation to the activity on a scale of 1 to 10. 1 being that you're not fatigued, and 10 being that bone crushing fatigue that was in the slide earlier. So on Monday, 8 a.m., somebody's having a shower and they've noticed a slight balance difficulty, and they've rated their fatigue around a 3. What we would suggest then is that we would look more into that morning routine, because although a 3 isn't very high, if you're having a slight balance difficulty in a shower, there'd be a concern maybe around a falls risk. So what we would kind of just look at delving into further is that wake up routine, or that morning routine, and see, does somebody need a little bit more time to wake up before they might need to have a shower? Would that help with the fatigue levels? Because some people, no more than myself, could be a little bit more groggy in the mornings and might need to actually do a couple of other things first before I do a big undertaking like potentially having a shower. If we move to Wednesday at lunchtime, somebody has gone to the supermarket to do the grocery shopping. They've loaded the bags into the car. They've noticed that their balance has been very, very poor, and it's slowed them down, and they've rated their fatigue level at an 8. So again, what we'd want to be looking at unpicking once we've looked at the entire week is, if lunchtime is the time that somebody feels very fatigued, is it the actual activity, going to the supermarket and loading the bags into the car and then coming home? Is that activity what's actually causing the fatigue? And do we need to break that task down even further? Do we need to look at changing the time? Do we need to look at what people are using to do the grocery shopping? Can we look at online shopping? Is there a support person to help lift things into the car if that's causing the difficulty? And really just unpick that task. Then Friday in the evening, it's eating dinner with the family, and the fatigue rating could be a 7. And again, some of that could be, you're coming to the end of the week, and, Friday and Saturday can often be a fatiguing time for people. But actually, again, what we'd look to be unpicking based on a diary of a weekly event would be to see if the evening time around that time was always the fatiguing time. And if you're struggling to have dinner with your family and being in that social setting and managing all the different conversations that might be going on, is there a strategy that you might be able to adopt in advance? So if dinner was going to be at that time, would it be helpful to maybe have a rest or a nap or some quiet time in advance of the dinner? If there's a lot of conversation going on at one time, is it just that we have to have a discussion with our family just to say, can we slow things down? But whatever it is, it's about unpicking it and finding what suits the person. But really all I'm showing you is a snapshot of 3 different activities, but it's about just showing how we're rating our fatigue levels, and then getting a really good snapshot across a week or 2 weeks and really identifying our fatigue levels. So for example, somebody might be not able to function as well in the morning, so they would do a lot of their more high intense activities in the afternoon or the evening, or like that, the evening might be very cognitively difficult for people. So they will want to make sure that they're doing anything in relation to financial planning or word searches, or even just looking at a weekly planner earlier in the day. But it's about finding what works for you. In terms of fatigue management, one thing that I think we've identified is that the battery, the optimal battery that people living with MS have, which is very different to people without MS. And you're functioning on a little bit of a less battery than somebody without MS, but still trying to do the same things. We would often, what the studies have suggested is that would be people with MS would be on about 30% less battery than would say myself. But you're still doing the exact same thing as me here this morning. You're sitting on this webinar and you're trying to take in all of the information as I'm trying to give it on 30% less battery. So it's really, really important to look at what fatigue strategies can work to support you in advance of these activities. And one of the things that we would be recommending is regular rest and a sleep routine. So when it comes to regular rest, one of the things we would be suggesting is the naps or the quiet times or the down times. But if somebody is having a nap, it's really important to identify the length of the nap that suits you, and to try and incorporate it into your routine where you can. So this slide just shows you the different lengths of naps and the impacts. So a 10 to 20-minute nap, which would obviously be our cat nap, it's called a power nap, and it will give you an immediate boost. You know, if you're just looking for something to try and get you through for the next couple of hours. So normally what we'd be recommending is that if somebody's going for a nap, that you set a timer, you set an alarm. So if it is that you're going to take that 20-minute nap, that you set the alarm after 20 minutes. 30-minute nap shows that you can wake up a little bit groggy, and it can take up to about a half an hour to come out of a 30-minute nap. A 60-minute nap would actually be a little bit better. You'd have a little bit more sleep. There'd be a lot more cognitive impacts from it, but you can be a little bit drowsy still when you're coming out of it. But a 90-minute nap, if at all possible, lets you go through a full sleep cycle, so a full REM, the rapid eye movement. And actually, what happens is when you come out of a 90-minute nap, you're actually able to come out of it a lot quicker than a 30-minute or a 60-minute nap. But it is about what suits you, and also what's suiting your lifestyle, and identifying from your fatigue diaries what type of nap you could slot in or fit in. In terms of other fatigue management strategies, we'd be looking at daily routine and goal setting. And again, your fatigue diary can certainly help with that. Looking at time management and prioritizing tasks, and really looking at that energy conservation. So really looking at the times of the day that suit you best and to do the most taxing activities during your optimal times. Really assessing your environment, so particularly in your kitchen or where you're spending your time. We'll say if we're looking at the kitchen, is everything that you need easy to hand? Or is there a lot of moving around the kitchen to go from one drawer to the fridge to the cooker? Is everything at hand level or eye level so that you're not overreaching? And an OT can really help with that. And you can be referred to an OT via your GP. And the MS Society can also help support you with signposting that. Medication can also have a huge impact on fatigue. And notwithstanding the medication that people with MS might need to take, but it's about just having a collaborative conversation with your GP around your medication management. And if you find that fatigue is it's persistent. Notwithstanding looking at diet and nutrition, it's a huge part of everybody's self-care at the moment. We're trying to manage fatigue, but particularly with people with MS. Exercise is another one, and stress management. So, obviously we're in a very difficult, unpredictable time at the moment, and there'll be a lot of focus on stress management and self-care during COVID. And it really is beyond that. To support people with MS and their fatigue, it is about trying to look at those stress management techniques as well, and cooling techniques. So really trying to balance that heat and cool impacts that people can have, because that can have a knock-on effect on fatigue. Looking at some relaxation techniques, so some deep breathing techniques, and I have a breathing technique I'll share with you in a little bit. Looking at social activities and maybe needing to pick and choose the activities that you engage in, and seeking professional help. As I've said, your GP, OT, physiotherapist, everybody that can be in your professional network, it would be useful to engage them. So before we move on to attention, is there any questions, or would there be any questions, John, or any comments?
Yeah, I have a question here from Carlo, who's asking, he's a lot tireder during the winter months without the sun, and just a question around vitamin D, and is it worth him taking more vitamin D? Do you have an idea about that, Michelle?
Yeah, I mean, certainly when it comes to the winter months and living with a neurological condition, it can have an impact. So realistically, if you're looking at vitamin D or some type of supplement, it is worth linking with your GP first and having a conversation with them around that. There could be other strategies within your home that you can look at. So it'll be about trying to create as much light within the house as you can. And if that can't be natural light, we'll say even, I know none of you can see me now today, but my office upstairs in my home it doesn't have as much natural light as downstairs. So I have other lighting, what do we call them? Implements around the office. So mirrors, extra lamps. There are a lot of other little things that you can have to create additional light. But certainly look at having a conversation with your GP. Also, the MS Society or an OT, if you have an OT, can support you with looking at different things around the home as well.
I actually have a quick question myself, Michelle, just in terms of fatigue and speech. Obviously, a lot of people with MS would have difficulties with their speech. Would fatigue be connected to that in any way?
Yes. Yeah. So when people are fatigued, there can be a slowed speech. So when we talk about the information processing, what we're talking about is the speed in which information is going in, but also the speed in which information is going back out. So it can then delay our speech. So our brain might be recognizing that we're trying to say something, but the words aren't coming out, or they're not coming out the right way, or we're forgetting the words. So absolutely. And again, your fatigue diary, if that's something that you're interested in, will identify that. You'll identify during sometimes in your day that your speech or your thinking might be more impacted. And during those times, you need to be looking at strategies to slow down and take a rest.
Okay, that's great. One other question that's just come in, Michelle. I find that I will be dog tired at the end of the day, but when I go to bed, I can't fall asleep. Any suggestions there?
Oh, it's the classic conundrum, isn't it? And normally when we're at that point, so when we're dog tired and then going to bed, we've moved into that overtired state. So when we move into the overtired state, we're going to really struggle with going to sleep. And what happens then is actually when you go to bed and you're struggling to sleep, what I would always recommend, and I fully appreciate this is easier said than done for some people, but it actually is to get back out of bed and get back out of that environment and go back into it when you're tired. But again, your fatigue diary will identify the strategies that you might need to be adopting in advance of getting to a stage of being dog tired, because you don't want to be getting to that point if at all possible. And again, everybody's lives are different, everybody's days are unique, but it is about looking at, how you can manage your day from morning to evening on a way that suits you, so that you're not getting to a point where you are absolutely wrecked at the end, because the sleep then that you have, it's not going to be as restorative as it needs to be. So my key would be really look at a fatigue diary first.
Okay, that's great, Michelle. Another quick question is, does anxiety impact on fatigue and speech?
Yeah, absolutely. So our mental health can absolutely impact any of the difficulties that we might be experiencing when living with MS. But when we're anxious, our brain is normally running at a very heightened state. And when our brain, or when we're thinking at a more heightened state, and particularly with the less battery, as I was talking about earlier, we're going to end up being more fatigued much quicker. And also, when we're living in that heightened state, it takes longer to come out of that fatigue. So, again, if people are struggling with anxiety, and even during COVID, people are struggling a lot more with anxiety and mood and mental health difficulties, it's about seeking some peer support. Again, either through the MS Society or the social media, the platforms that you're all engaging in, as well as linking with your GP or another professional, whether that be a counsellor like myself, or the HSE counselling service through the GP, to try and look at that anxiety management piece. because again, there are a lot of strategies. We could do a whole webinar on anxiety management and MS, but it's about looking at what's going to suit you. But one of the things that as I've mentioned earlier, that I'll have in a slide later, is just a quick breathing technique, because that can really help slow the anxieties down. It can slow our thinking down, and physiologically, it will literally slow our bodies down, which will help.
Okay, I think fatigue, like you say, fatigue itself could be a whole webinar on its own as well. I've got two other quick questions, and then maybe we can move on, because I don't want to spend too long on one particular symptom. So this person has an inability to read, as double vision at times, and has memory difficulties. That is, can't remember names or characters in books. What would that be linked to, Michelle? Would that possibly be a fatigue, or is that, a general cognitive difficulty?
I think it's a more general cognitive difficulty. It could be exacerbated by fatigue. So memory will always be exacerbated by fatigue, and as would the double vision. But, if there's already a vision symptom, some of that could just be a generic cognitive impairment as well. And again, it's very useful to, discuss even, symptoms with your MS nurse or your GP, just to kind of get a bit more of an understanding of what's going on for you. What we would always recommend as well, and again, it's different for everybody how they do it, but just keeping track of symptoms, so just logging a symptom can be very useful in advance of going into appointments with neurologists when people get to see them. Because when we go into these appointments, we might forget what we want to be bringing to the table, and we can get caught up in the discussions that are happening there in the room. So we would always recommend just keeping a log of symptoms and just engaging with the professionals when you can.
One last question, Michelle. My fatigue hits me very suddenly. 1 minute I'm fine, and the next minute I have to lie down. And if I don't, I can collapse. This did happen once. It's just, I don't know when it's going to hit me. It's horrible when I wake. I feel awful. And I've done the fatigue diary, and I am adjusting things. And this is something that's recurring again in just last week. So any suggestions there, Michelle?
I mean, for starters, well done on recognizing, regardless of anything else, you need to lie down. The fatigue that people are experiencing, as this person said, is it can be so sudden. You can be absolutely fine now, and literally in 2 minutes time, even during the webinar, you might just be absolutely dog tired, as somebody else has just mentioned, to the point of not being able to function. Fatigue can come and go in waves in relation to our MS. And normally what happens is, if it gets very intense like it is now, it is about, as that person is saying, going back, looking at their fatigue diary and trying to make other adjustments. It could also be, and again, I'm not trying to suggest that the GP is the answer for everything, but sometimes linking the GP, if you've noticed that something is getting a little bit worse, it is worth linking in with the GP just to get their advice, because it could be something else that you might need to look at in relation to your medication. But as I've already said, the other strategies up there as well around diet, nutrition, exercise, stress management, they're all things that unfortunately need to be adjusted. And our strategies are live. They're going to change and adapt as our needs change and adapt. So if somebody's in a more severe state of fatigue at the minute, the strategies will need to be, really the focus of their day-to-day at the minute to try and combat it again. But I would also still think about linking in with the GP.
Okay, just two more quick ones. Is exercise worth the energy loss to create energy in the longer term, do you think?
Yeah, I think every physio in the MS Society would say absolutely it is worth doing the exercise. There's so many, national studies from UL and NUIG in collaboration with the MS Society around the benefits of exercise. And again, if you're looking at engaging in some type of exercise and trying to, as you said, compensate for potential energy loss afterwards, link in with the MS Society as well, though, because they can absolutely help try and support you via the exercise programs. But absolutely, we would be all saying and recommending that some exercise is needed.
Okay, and Michelle, just this last one now on this actual topic. I work full-time in a busy, pressurized job. At times I find it difficult to persuade myself to do a task, even though I know that it should be done. It's okay if there's an absolute deadline, but otherwise it just sits on my to-do list. Any suggestions?
I think there's a couple of different things there. Working in a pressurized environment is very difficult to maintain. And we can all get caught up in the busyness of that and we can feel quite overwhelmed. And often then we will end up putting tasks, down the pecking order unless, as that person said, we have a deadline. So it's probably about looking at the strategy. So breaking down the tasks. So if there are certain tasks that need to be done, you're going to prioritize those today. But if there are other things that aren't as essential but still need to get done, it's probably just about looking at how you can break that down to make it just even a little bit more manageable. So even if it's to do that task for 10 minutes and then come away from it again and go back to it. But it is about looking at goal setting and breaking it down. The motivation piece potentially as well. We'd probably look at that if we were working on a one-to-one, because some tasks we're not going to feel motivated in. We're also, if we're fatigued, it's going to impact how we're managing on a day-to-day and work as well. But it's also about looking at that energy conservation piece. So if there are times during the day where you function very, very well, it's about maybe seeing if you could throw those less motivating tasks into that time of the day.
That's great, Michelle. I think we'll just carry on now, if that's okay with you. Yeah.
So we might just move on to attention and concentration. So when people talk about having memory difficulties and being forgetful or whatever, it actually would always stem from a difficulty with attention first. So making a conscious decision to pay attention to something is important, because when we're attending to something, the information is getting processed and it's getting encoded into our brain, it's getting stored, which then actually helps us retrieve it, which is what the memory is. So if we're not processing it and attending to it, we're not going to be able to store it and retrieve it. So attention basically is just our ability to focus on certain aspects of the environment. But also it's important to recognize when it comes to attention, our attention is greater when we're interested in the topic. So for some people, fatigue management, as we've just covered, might be very, very interesting for some people, and your attention might be very, very strong for it. For somebody else, the next section on memory might be something that you're very, very interested in. You might want to hold your attention for that. And we're all guilty of it. But what we're trying to look at doing with our attention is to be able to flexibly manipulate the information. We want the information to be readily available to us in our brains. So the important thing when we're looking at attention and strategies is to identify the types of attention that we all have, and to look at, again, what we were talking about earlier with compensation strategies, looking at what our strengths are. So in terms of attention, it's about identifying out of these 5, which ones we're very strong on. So we've got our focused attention, which is our ability to attend to a task and avoid all distractions. Our sustained attention, so it's our ability to concentrate for a very specific length of time. Our selective then is to avoid every distraction, but you mightn't be able to attend to the task. Our alternating attention is our ability to shift our focus between one task and another. And then our divided is about the completing multiple tasks at once. And again, when you're looking even at a fatigue diary, our fatigue can impact our ability to attend to certain things. The time of the day might impact our ability to attend to certain things. So, for example, when in rehab care, when we're working with people living with MS, when I go and I meet with people first and we discuss what people's needs are and what people want from working with us, one of the first things I will always ask those, what's the best time of the day that suits you? And we will come and work with you around that specific time. So it's really important about looking at your best times so that you can manage all the cognitive impacts. So that slide is just up for you to have a think. The slides can be available afterwards if you wish, but it's just to have a think about what type of attention you think you work very well on. A lot of us might be able to identify a strength in our sustained attention, so our ability to concentrate for a very specific length of time. Our focused attention can be a little bit harder, can be a bit more taxing to really just focus on one thing and avoid everything else. And I think we can all be very guilty of multitasking, and the difficulty with multitasking is potentially not doing one task in its entirety. So it's just about looking at what you think you do well in terms of attention and managing strategies around it. So the main strategies to improve attention is absolutely trying to minimize distractions where you can. Again, it is about that fatigue and that time management piece. So really looking at the time of the day that suits you, the time that you're doing the task. Often what people have said to us is giving warning for something changing or a task changing. And again, that's easier said than done, because in a work environment, for example, you might be in a meeting and there might be 6 things in an agenda. Realistically, somebody mightn't say, right, we're going to stop talking about fatigue and we're going to talk about attention. But it's about you trying to give yourself a warning that something has changed. So that internal voice saying, we're now talking about attention. And that's you switching your attention to what it is that needs your attention right now. It's also about pacing your attention, so distributing an activity over a period of time. So no more than that last question around, managing the workload, doing a task that you're not feeling that motivated to do. It's about trying to really break it down, include rest breaks, include what other strategies you might need, getting up, moving around, taking yourself out of an environment, whatever it is that works for you. So then if we want to look at moving into memory, so if we've got those strategies of just really trying to minimize distractions and slowing down, it should help improve our memory, because our memory takes on 3 different processes. So there's an awful lot going on just to try and remember something. You're trying to encode it, which is you're trying to get it into your brain. You're trying to store it in your brain. And then you're trying to retrieve it in 10 minutes when we have our exam on this slide. Obviously, we don't have an exam, but you would want to be trying to retrieve things for yourself. We each have a short-term memory and a long-term memory. So our long-term memory is going to be things that we can remember 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Our short-term is going to be anything from last week to now. And our short and long-term memories are dependent on how we're going to be taking in that information, how we're going to store it, and how we're going to get it back out. So this next slide is going to show you, it's going to be more visual in terms of what I mean. So when this is what our brain would look like when we're trying to look at memory. So we've got information going in. So from the left-hand side of the slide, the information is me talking now. That's going into your short-term memory. Realistically, if you are trying to take in information and remember it, you're going to try and rehearse it or repeat it in your brain. If we move up to the top arrows, where it goes to not coded and forgotten. So if it's already gone into our short-term memory bank and we haven't repeated it or rehearsed it, it hasn't coded. So it's not going to store. So we're going to forget it. Then if we move into the middle piece, so if it's in our short-term memory and we are coding it, so we are repeating it, we are rehearsing it, we're doing that inner self dialogue of trying to really remember it and get it in there. It is more often than not going to go into our long-term memory bank where we can actually call it back out again. If we move to the bottom arrows, so again, the information has gone in, we're rehearsing it, we're calling it, but what we're actually doing is we're then retrieving it immediately. So if I was to ask you something about fatigue management that I have just said, if I've asked you to repeat it to me, you're immediately retrieving what's just gone into your short-term memory. And by doing that and doing that correctly, you're going to be more likely to remember what's needed. But the key here is to retrieve it and recall it correctly. So if you're giving an answer to a question and the answer is wrong, more often than not, what will happen actually is that you will have coded that wrong answer. So you may not have a difficulty with recalling the information or retrieving it, but it might be incorrect. So it's really important when you're repeating the information to yourself that you're repeating it correctly. Or if you're looking to understand something more, to ask the question before you're trying to repeat it to yourself. It's very important that the information is correct. So normally when we're all together, we would kind of have a little bit more of a chat around this slide, but I hope it's clear that the main thing here is that you're trying to repeat the information to yourself and then try and repeat it to somebody else or even out loud, just to have that storage space. You want to be able to do as much as you can to keep it in your memory bank so that you can bring it back out again.
Michelle, a quick question from myself. So in terms of when you say coding and kind of repeating, would an example be when you meet somebody new and they introduce themselves that you more or less say their name back to them? Is that kind of a...
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
And even in the next slide, we talk about strategies and associations, and that can be a really useful one for when we're looking at trying to remember a name. But quite often with me, so again, if we go with the information, my name is Michelle. So John, you're trying to process it in your short-term memory. So you're repeating Michelle, but what you might need is an association to help code it. So quite often people will immediately think of the song Michelle My Belle. So straight away they've now coded it and it goes into their long-term memory. So regardless of you not remembering my name, you're going to remember something about Belle, and then you'll actually be able to retrieve Michelle.
Right.
But absolutely, it's a great question. Yeah.
Great. 1 sec, I think we've got another question coming in. Okay, yeah. This question is, I find myself in a room and forgetting why I went there. This happens daily. Any tips to help there? And are crosswords and card games, that sort of thing, are they good to do?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think everybody can be very guilty of going into another room and not remembering why they're there. And particularly with living with MS, and again, exacerbated by fatigue, that can get worse. So you really would become very forgetful. So again, it's that inner self dialogue piece. So if you're looking to go into another room, your brain has already identified that you need to go into that other room, regardless of you recognizing it. So what you need to try and do is catch that thought. So it's about being more mindful. And again, a lot of buzz talk around mindfulness the last couple of years, but it can be really useful with managing cognitive impacts. So if you've recognized that you need to go into another room, you need to catch that thought, and you act. What we've identified with people that we've worked with is saying out loud then why you need to go into the other room really helps with that encoding piece. So you're identifying that there's information there that needs to go into your memory. So if I need to go to my bookshelf here and I get to the bookshelf and I see 18 different books and I have no idea what book I needed, I need to try and go back and retrace my steps and see why it was that I wanted to go to the bookcase in general, and then what book it was I needed, and talk myself through that. So normally if we're looking to go into another room, so if we're in the sitting room and we look to go into the kitchen, there's normally a reason why we're looking to go into the kitchen, which could be to cook something, make a cup of tea, answer the phone, write on the planner. There's going to be cues already that you can retrace. But it's absolutely about trying to catch the thought and trying to, code it by talking out loud to yourself about where it is you're going and why. And then we will get to the strategies now in a second, but absolutely word searches and card games are fantastic. But again, it's up to the individual which ones would suit.
Great, great. Thanks, Michelle. I think we can carry on.
Perfect. So then in terms of some strategies, again, similar to attention, it's about really trying to minimize the distractors. It's really about trying to focus on one task at a time. Can't stress enough the importance of repetition. Even if it's to yourself, if it's out loud when nobody else is there, if it's to say it to somebody else, but really look at that repetition piece. It's so beneficial. Asking questions to help ensure comprehension or attention, because quite often what can happen, particularly even in a webinar like this, there's a lot of information being thrown at everybody. And if we were all together, if some of you have been at any of these talks before, you'd often have heard me say, does that make sense or is that okay? And people will always say yes, but actually it's then when you go and you try and ask questions, you'll be able to identify if actually you've understood the information or if there's a gap, if you actually got part A and you're missing part B. So it's really useful to ask questions. The associations that we've just mentioned can be really, really useful. And again, it depends on the person. But obviously, if you're looking at trying to remember things like a notepad by the phone for taking a message, having something by the door for keys, even like a checklist type of thing in one room for another room. So lots of associations with names, as I've said, with me, it's quite often Michelle My Belle. But associations can work very well, but it has to suit you. For me, associations wouldn't be my strongest strategy. I'd be probably better with the checklists and something a lot more visual, which is what I've just identified here. So a lot of visual cues or verbal cues. So you're looking at reminders, you're looking at prompts, you're looking at choices. And you want to try and do as much of those cue pieces for yourself as you can, so that actually, instead of asking somebody else what it is, you want to try and identify it, so that actually, again, it strengthens your encoding process. Because if somebody else just gives you the information all the time, your brain isn't working as much as it could. Another strategy is about prioritizing information that needs to be remembered. So in terms of chunking, so again, if you have a checklist of things, it's about maybe prioritizing in that list for today, for example, what you need to remember. So it could be that, for example, I needed to remember to be on the webinar this morning. And I know I have one call after lunch. They're the two things I've looked to remember for today. Everything else, it's written down, and I will look at it and I will get to it. But those are the two pieces of information I wanted to prioritize for today. Then in terms of memory and attention aids, so a lot of the external memory aids that we would always look at are checklists. I can't stress enough the use of like checklists and a notebook or a diary. But again, the type of notebook or diary that suits you. So what suits me is, physically writing something down. That helps me strengthen my encoding process. That may not be something that's even possible for somebody else. And you might need to look at something touch screen. And even at that, you might be able to look to a screen for very long. It might be a visual calendar. It's whatever's going to work for you. Lists, memo boards, electronic organizers, alarms and timers can be quite good, particularly if you're cooking. And if you have a chicken in the oven and then you're trying to go and do another task, or you're feeling fatigued, or you end up having a nap without even realizing you've had a nap, an alarm or a timer when you're cooking is very, very useful memory aid. Or also a dictaphone. So, again, if you're in a meeting or if you're in a webinar or if you're in something, a dictaphone can be very, very useful to help remember. You just have, if you are using a dictaphone with somebody else, you just have to ask them if it's okay. But even for yourself, if you're going around your house trying to think of, you're trying to talk yourself around things that need to be done or things you want to plan for next week, a dictaphone can be really useful. And we have that on a lot of our smartphones. But then in terms of cognitive exercises that can really help flex that cognitive muscle, that brain, jigsaws, card games, listening to music is a really good one, meditation or mindfulness. And I would highly recommend Pádraig Ó Móráin. He is like the Irish guru of mindfulness. He makes mindfulness very accessible. He has a lot of social media around LinkedIn and Facebook, and just lots of little tips, really easy tips around meditation and mindfulness. Word searches are really good, and crosswords. And again, it's about what works for you. There's also a lot of apps though that can be really, really good if that's your thing, which is like memory matching, Matrix Brain, Free Flow, the attention tests. And again, you don't need to be doing them for very long, but they're good at really getting that brain flexing. And you'll find which ones suit you, but they would be the four we would have used quite a lot. Some of them you can trial. Actually, sorry, all of them you can trial. But some of them are free, but some of them obviously you would pay after a trial. So it's about seeing what works.
One other quick question, Michelle.
Yeah.
Does routine help memory? So if you've got a routine, would that be beneficial? Yeah.
Absolutely. And again, that will come up in your fatigue diary, what works well for you in terms of routine. And it's also notwithstanding the fact that with life, sometimes routine goes out the window. But yeah, absolutely. So a morning routine and evening routine can be really, really useful when it comes to fatigue management and, getting to sleep. No more than that question earlier around feeling dog tired and then struggling to sleep. Having a really good evening routine bedded in can help with that. Routine and work as much as you can. Absolutely. Routine at home. Routine is going to be a key with a lot of cognitive impacts. Yeah.
Thanks, Michelle.
I'm very conscious of time, but I'm nearly finished if you're all able to stick with me. Just want to switch to emotional adjustment. And I won't spend a huge amount of time on this one. But in terms of emotional adjustment, so living with MS, people can experience lots of different reactions at different times. So people might feel quite anxious, might feel low, depressed or frustrated or really overwhelmed with everything, confused, annoyed at another flare up or whatever. So people with MS, in terms of emotional adjustment, you're emotionally processing or trying to make sense of the condition all the time. You're learning about it, you're learning about yourself, you're learning about your family, learning about your supports, all of the time. But everyone's experience is different, and there's no time limit to it. But the adjustment difficulties, more than what I was saying earlier about fatigue and really stressing the importance of fatigue management, it's adjustment difficulties, they're very common, they're very real, they're very ongoing, and again, they're ongoing at different times and at different phases for people. But why have our emotions been affected? So there is direct neurological damage. So no more than what we were talking about earlier with our neurons and that underground train map, the signals are getting blocked. But it's also the stress and adjustment to new life circumstances. Or like that question earlier, this week again, fatigue seems to be very severe. That can be very stressful and that can impact how we feel. Also, our physical and our social environment can impact how we're feeling. So, being in a social setting or not being able to be in a social setting can have an impact. Being in a physical environment, so even for example, people shopping at the minute is evoking a huge stress response in people during COVID. So it is like there are lots of different factors that are going to affect people's emotions when living with MS. The common signs of emotional difficulties, I'm not going to spend too long on these at all, but there's, physical signs like stomach aches, you've got your muscle tension, you're shaking, you've got sleep pattern difficulties, you can feel frustrated, you can be angry, you can withdraw, you can be very worried. You can be worried about the future, you can be worried about your health, you can be worried about your family. So there can be just a lot of that heightened state of thinking all of the time. One of the techniques that we would always recommend that I said I'd get to was the breathing technique. So this can really just help slow that thinking process down, slow the body down, and it can really help just evoke that almost relaxed response. And it's a very easy breathing technique. It's called 4-7-8. So if everybody just wants to take a quick breath in through your nose to the count of 4, 3, 2, 1. And if you want to hold it for 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And then take a big exhale, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And then it's just about doing that 4-7-8 for a couple of times and just really slowing down. And I can't stress enough the importance of our breath and it having such an immediate positive impact on how we're feeling. And again, in terms of mindfulness, there's a lot of tools, a lot of techniques out there, but a lot of them will always talk about bringing it back to your breath. And again, you'll find breathing techniques that work for you. For some, it mightn't be the 4-7-8. It could be something else. It could literally just be taking a breath in and taking a longer breath out. Find something that works for you. The other thing that we really wouldn't stress enough would be around the peer learning, being able to talk to other people who are going through what you're going through. So those social supports, those support groups, social media. I think one of the benefits of COVID has been the amount of online platforms we now have available to us that we've never had before. For example, this webinar has been open to lots more people than maybe it would have been if we weren't in COVID, because it would have been in Limerick or Galway or something. So it's about really trying to maximize those supports that you already have, or, trying to dip your toe into those supports. So, really linking with the MS Society, if and when you can be such a huge support for you. But the other people then that can help you is obviously your supporters, your family and your friends, your neurology team, your GP. And I mean, I know the Neurological Alliance of Ireland have sent out their most recent report, and obviously there's still concerns with access to neurology, but even just contacting your MS nurse, that's a huge resource to have. A neuropsychologist if available, or a psychologist, counselor, psychotherapist, somebody that you're able to talk through how you're feeling. And those community services. So again, your GP can help refer you and signpost you to community services that can be available to you. And they're different in each region. So really maximize your GP, your MS nurse, your local, your regional MS Society, and they will really help signpost you where they can. The other resource then was the MS information line. John, I'm actually not sure if this information line is still active. I meant to ask you that.
Yeah, yep, it's active. It's open from 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. Monday to Friday, Michelle. So that's available to anyone. Yeah.
Brilliant. And I suppose we would have collaborated a huge amount with the MS Society here in Galway, and we would have worked with an awful lot of people living with MS, and this would have been one of the resources that they found really helpful in the past. So it's great actually that it's even changed to 10 to 5. So really, use that resource as well. There's a lot of things available to you via the MS Society. These are just some other resources. So obviously you have online the MS Society in Ireland and the MS Society in the UK. You've got the National MS Society. And then also just another one that I found really useful was just brainhealthforms.com. But again, people are going to find what works for you. And it's important even just to share. So if you're in a peer network with each other, sharing what you find that works well. And just to wrap up, if you're all still with me, obviously cognitive symptoms, they can be silent and debilitating. So we're really trying to highlight the invisible difficulties that people with MS can be experiencing, and really just try and bring that to the fore and advocate for you needing supports and strategies around this. It can affect all aspects of your daily living, and it's unique. It's different for everybody. But the consistent use of the strategies can really help with those impairments. But it's about, that pick and mix, finding what works for you, linking in with other people to really help build your strategy toolbox if you need to, and really looking at that peer support piece. And that's it. And thank you very much, everybody.
That's great, Michelle. Thanks very much. I've just got a last couple of questions. Would pain be related in any way to cognitive difficulties? We have somebody who's asking around, they have extreme pain all day in head pain. Would you have any ideas there? Or
Absolutely. So it was a chronic pain can have a huge impact on the cognitive impairments, particularly fatigue, and particularly actually the emotional impacts. People can get very frustrated, very anxious, very sad in relation to it. So when it comes to pain, it's about, really trying to build that relationship with your neuro team, your GP, and looking at meds around that. Also potentially looking at referrals to pain clinics. Again, I know there's a significant waiting list for the pain clinics, but it would be important to get on that waiting list. We would have worked with some people, again, here in Galway, who we would have got referred to the pain clinic, and they would have had, I suppose what happens then is you get a tailored pain management program, and that can be really, really beneficial. So that pain referral can be done via your GP.
That's great. Thanks, Michelle. I've got one last comment, really more than anything. It's just a question around antidepressants, people who are experiencing emotional difficulties with MS. Certainly in my own experience in working with the MS Society, it would be very hard to say a number of people who are on antidepressants, but there would be people who would be using antidepressants to cope with emotional distress. So it's a difficult question to put any sort of figure on or say how many people are actually using them. But some people obviously get benefit from them, and we would always advise that you speak to your GP or your neurologist around these sort of issues.
Absolutely, and the thing with any type of meds, and again, everybody on this webinar is going to be more of an expert in relation to med management, but it's about finding something that suits you. So if you're recommended something to try, keep an eye, no more than what I was suggesting a while ago around symptoms. Keep an eye on the symptoms with those meds. So if somebody is on an antidepressant or starting an antidepressant, keep an eye on those symptoms for the first couple of weeks and really link in with your prescriber, and engage in that collaborative discussion around whether or not that needs to be tweaked or changed. But it's really important to keep communicating with them.
One last comment here, Michelle. In terms of rehab care themselves, the service that you offer, is that similar around the country? There's a question here.
Yeah, it's not at the minute. It's something that we're going to be looking at introducing around the country. Absolutely. It's something that we've raised already with funders and with the Neurological Alliance. So at the minute, it's just in Galway. But it is on our radar, absolutely. I suppose certainly the MS Society and the people that we've worked with have found it very helpful. So we have looked to advocate for it everywhere else.
Yeah, I mean, I could confirm that we've worked with Michelle and Rehab Care in the Western region for the last 9 years, I think, or maybe more, on a cognitive program for people with MS, and it's been very successful with a lot of people. So yeah, if anybody's interested in that and they're living in the Galway area, they can contact myself, and we can refer in. But it is just for the Galway area, unfortunately, at this stage.
But I suppose the benefit of it being in Galway, even for now, John, was we were able to, you know, really work with yourselves and the people living with MS, the experts, and really fine tune the program.
Yeah.
Everything, even today's webinar, is all from experts from yourselves. So, you know, when we're looking at being able to going everywhere else, it's fine tuned now, hopefully.
Yeah, it's great, and it's great that it's an actual one-to-one program. You know, and it's been very successful. So I think I'm very conscious of the time now as well, and I want to thank Dr. Murphy very much for her time and for a really comprehensive presentation for us this morning. So I hope that everybody's had some great benefit from it. I'm sure you have. I just want to remind you all that it has been recorded, and it will be available on the MS Society's YouTube page in the next few weeks. The next few days. I think there was a number of questions around the slides possibly being available in hard copy as well. So we'll talk to Michelle about that and see what we can do there. So hopefully we'll be able to do that. So I just want to thank everybody for attending, and I want to thank Dr. Murphy again for her expertise and for giving us the time today, and hope you enjoyed the webinar, and we'll see you all again soon, hopefully on another platform. Thanks very much.
Thank you.